What is up, you guys? This is Anthony Metro here with the Anthony Metro podcast. And today I'm going to tell you how the Mets can round out the offseason to make it a winner. If you like this podcast, be sure to follow me on Spotify, radio.com, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Anthony Metro, where I post all the latest news, rumors, and highlights for the Mets and Major League Baseball. So without any further ado, how can Brodie Van Wagenen finish this offseason to make it a successful one? Let's begin and circle back and look at what has kind of happened in the Mets realm so far this offseason. Of course, just like any other year with the Mets, it has been an up and down offseason to this point. It began with the Mets firing Mickey Callaway, which led to a lengthy managerial search, and it ultimately ended with the Mets hiring Carlos Beltran. The Mets flirted with Joe Girardi, a favorite among a large contingent of Mets fans, but Girardi, of course, was hired by the Philadelphia Phillies for $10 million before the Mets hired Beltran. So this, of course, sparked the very familiar rumblings about how the Mets would rather save money than hire an expensive manager. Though, of course, the Mets cite that Beltran was the person they wanted for the job. Further fanning the flames on that issue, however, was Zach Wheeler leaving the Mets to sign with the rival Phillies on a 5-year deal worth $118 million. So while the Mets did lose out on Girardi and Wheeler, they have made a few savvy acquisitions, in my opinion. The Mets signed Michael Wacha to a $3 million deal worth up to $10 million in incentives attached to his performance. And the very next day, the Mets signed Rick Porcello to a 1-year deal worth $9 million. Van Wagenen also made a trade for Astro center fielder Jake Marisnick for two lesser-known prospects, right-handed pitcher Blake Taylor, who the Mets acquired way back in the day for Ike Davis, and outfielder Kennedy Corona. Marisnick is a stellar center fielder, although he is a light hitter, so he will essentially be replacing Juan Lagares' role with the Mets. So at this current juncture, the Mets have lost Zach Wheeler, and they have added Jake Marisnick, Michael Wacha, and Rick Porcello to the Major League roster. However, the most glaring issue is still yet to be addressed: the Achilles heel of the 2019 Mets, the bullpen. So how can Van Wagenen round out this offseason and make it a successful one? For starters, it's necessary that we first determine where the Mets payroll currently is in relation to the competitive balance tax. It seems the Mets are unwilling to go over the competitive balance tax figure, which is set for $208 million for the 2020 season. No matter how much fans and the media plead that the first-time offender is actually not hit with too severe of a penalty. The big news last week, of course, was the reduction in Yoenis Cespedes' salary for 2020 after he and the Mets came to an agreement involving the investigation surrounding the ankle injury that he had suffered on his ranch last year while rehabbing from his double heel surgery in 2018. So there is actually some belief that this reduction in salary could actually mean as much as $19.5 million being shed from the Mets' current competitive balance tax figure. So with that, I'm going to work under the assumption that the Mets' current CBT payroll stands at $182.95 million, putting them approximately $25 million below the CBT penalty figure. So what should the Mets do with this new financial windfall? Number one, sign relief pitcher Will Harris. So I know many of you probably expected me to say Dellin Betances. However, after a lot of reflection, a lot of thinking, I think Will Harris would be a better move, and here is why. Will Harris has a consistent track record spanning 5 seasons. He has an ERA of 2.42 during that time, and he was stellar for the Astros last year with an ERA of 1.50. He had a postseason ERA of 1.86, and his WHIP was 0.93 last year. 0.93. And you know what? For the last 5 years, it's been as low as 0.90, and it's pretty much hovering right around 1.05. He's great against lefties and righties. He's holding left-handers last year to a 207 average and righties to a 183 average. I think he has great durability, and he hasn't been overused, which I find very appealing about him. He pitched just 60 innings in 2019, 56 in 2018, and 45 in 2017, not counting any of his playoff innings as well. In regards to Betances, He's looking for a 1-year deal, we hear. We know he wants to get $10 million for that year. He's coming off a season in which he only had one appearance because of an Achilles injury, and it's a bit worrisome to me. The Mets obviously have never had good luck in regards to injuries. We all know that. And I know Mets fans are already up in arms when it comes to bringing in former Yankees. So given his cost and the unknown in regards to his injury, I don't know if I want the Mets to go down that road, especially at that high of a cost. He really kind of seems like a complete variable to me, whereas Harris seems to really have an impressive track record of consistency. And, I think he actually is going to come a little bit cheaper than $10 million per year. And that is mainly because Harris is 34 years old. So let's take a look at the market. We know Blake Treinen got a 1-year deal for $10 million from the Los Angeles Dodgers. We have heard Betances is asking for pretty much the same deal, 1 year for $10 million. I think that we'll end up seeing Harris getting somewhere between $8 and $12 million annually. I could see it happening over a 2-year deal. Now, I don't know if the Mets are willing to go for 2 years. However, I do think that is what Harris is going to ask for, being 34 years old. I think Jake Diekman's recent signing with the Athletics is a very good barometer for us to look at and judge Harris's contract on. The left-hander reliever, he's 32 years old, Diekman that is. He had signed for a 1-year deal worth $7.5 million to remain with the Athletics. So given Harris's age, he will be looking for a 2-year deal, and based on his track record, I'm inclined to give it to him. And I'm going to say the Mets could sign him for 2 years for a total of $16 million, so a luxury tax hit of $8 million in 2020. Number 2, sign catcher Jason Castro. So the Mets were blessed to have a full and healthy season from Wilson Ramos, which resulted in an extremely productive one at the plate for him. It was clearly the best production the Mets have gotten from the catcher position in recent years. However, it was, of course, not all rosy for Ramos, as he struggled defensively. His pitch framing was in the bottom half of the league, and of course, we all know the issues Noah Syndergaard had pitching to Ramos. So he struggled to throw out base runners as well, which has been an issue that has long plagued the Mets, though. And how much of that is on their catchers and how much of that should fall on the pitching staff is honestly debatable. I can't really fault Ramos for that alone. Enter Jason Castro. Castro is 32 years old. He spent last season with the Minnesota Twins, and he enjoyed his best offensive season of his career with a 767 OPS. For the record, Ramos's OPS was 768 last year. I have a feeling the Mets are not going to be as fortunate with Ramos's durability this year, and they can't simply run Tomas Nido out there with his OPS plus of 46. Castro would be the perfect complement for a makeshift catching platoon in an effort to keep Ramos healthy and productive. Ramos, we all know, hits lefties very well. Well, the great news is that Jason Castro, who is actually left-handed himself, was very good against right-handed pitchers last year. He hit .254 with an .854 OPS versus righties, compared to his splits against lefties, where it's a paltry 125 average and 347 OPS versus lefties. But what Jason Castro does provide is excellent defense behind home plate, something Van Wagenen himself said he wanted to address this offseason. Castro ranked as one of the better pitch framers in the league last year. He ranked out at number 25 out of 117 catchers, and he is ranked in the top 30 each of the last 3 seasons and as high as 16th overall in 2017. So let's take a look at the catcher market. We saw Yasmani Grandal cash out with the White Sox on a 4-year deal worth $73 million. We saw Travis d'Arnaud go to the Braves for 2 years and $16 million. But what we should do is take a look at the Twins' replacement for Castro in Alex Avila, who ranks out similarly as a defensive first catcher. He signed with the Twins this offseason for 1 year and $4.25 million. I think the Mets can sign Castro for 2 years for a $10 million, which would result in a cap hit of $5 million for competitive balance tax purposes for 2020. Number 3, sign relief pitcher Craig Stammen. So in my scenario, the Mets already added Will Harris to the bullpen, but I don't want it to stop there. The current bullpen has major flaws. Edwin Diaz and Yuris Familia aside, Robert Gesellman really does not inspire any confidence in me, and that does not even begin to touch on the relievers that the Mets ran out there last year. I'm talking about Chris Flexen, Daniel Zamora, Jacob Rom, Tyler Basher, Brooks Pounders, Chris Mazza, Paul Sewald, Drew Gagnon. I mean, the list goes on, and truthfully, I don't want to see any of those guys this year. Now, look, obviously, I know it's inevitable some of them will pitch for this team, but I think it's fair to say that each of those guys took a step backwards last year. And I think it's never more evident than in the fact that Chris Flexen and Mazza actually just recently agreed to pitch in the Korean League next season. So this is why I stress the fact the Mets need to land Craig Stammen in addition to Will Harris. Stammen spent the last 3 seasons with the Padres after he began his career with the Washington Nationals. With San Diego, he had a collective ERA of 3.05 from 2017 to 2019, and his strikeout per 9 has hovered between 8 and 10 during that time. So now the concerning part, what I alluded to earlier about Will Harris and how he was not overly used, at least based on his innings, Stammen has been quite the opposite the last 3 years. He has pitched almost exactly 80 innings each of the last 3 seasons. So 240 innings in 3 seasons is a hefty toll on a reliever, but especially one that is 35 years old. Nonetheless, I still think he would round out this bullpen and, along with Harris, ultimately make it one of the best in the National League. Given his age and his recent use with the Padres, I would only sign Stammen to a 1-year deal. I think we could get him for $4 million, but it's almost double the pay he got last season with the Padres. Of course, the Mets are going to have to pay up a little bit more because it's only going to be a 1-year deal. So Stammen, 1 year, $4 million tax hit. And number 4, sign Brad Miller. So when I first began writing this, I actually wanted the Mets to get Eric Sogard. I actually have him written down, and then I did strike through text over his name. Eric Sogard, I had been looking at his stats the last couple of days. However, when I went to go and write this, I saw that he had signed with the Milwaukee Brewers only 22 hours earlier. So Eric Sogard, he was my first choice. However, Brad Miller is not a bad consolation prize. Miller spent last season with the Philadelphia Phillies and has spent time with Cleveland, Milwaukee, Tampa Bay, and Seattle in his career. And he has played almost every position in the big leagues. Most recently with the Phillies, he was playing third base, left field, center field, right field, shortstop, and he has even cameoed at first base as well. So not only has he shown the ability to play those positions, but he's shown that he can actually play them pretty well. He's ranking out positively or close to positively in defensive runs saved at almost all of those positions that I listed. Last season, between time with the Phillies and the Indians, he hit for a combined .894 OPS in 79 games. This, of course, is much higher than his career norm, which is .733 OPS, so I do expect some regression. Still, he did hit 13 home runs, and I do understand 12 of those were with the Phillies, but in fairness, only 6 of them were at Citizens Bank Park. So I think it's necessary I mention that before anyone insinuates him having any type of contrasting home and road splits. Versatility is really one of the biggest things that I stress when it comes to building a big league roster. If you take a look around the league and you look at a team like the Dodgers, I mean, we could just go on and on with the guys that they find in trades or through free agency that didn't have very much interest and have turned into extremely good and versatile players. I mean, just to start, Chris Taylor, Max Muncy, Kike Hernandez. I mean, you could put those guys almost at any position in the field, and they also can hit. So the Mets were fortunate to find someone like that in J.D. Davis last year, and I really could see Brad Miller being a part of that and being a really good part of the Mets bench next season. I think Miller and the aforementioned Sogard are cut from the same cloth. Like I mentioned, Sogard signed with the Brewers for $4.5 million, but I think the Mets can get the less touted Brad Miller for about 1 year, $2 million. So in summation, we added Will Harris for 2 years at $16 million for a cap hit of $8 million in 2020. We signed Jason Castro for 2 years at $10 million for a cap hit of $5 million. We signed Craig Stammen for 1 year at $4 million and Brad Miller for 1 year at $2 million for a total of $19 million in cap hits, keeping us just under the competitive balance tax for 2020. I think we improved the bullpen to one of the best in the National League with Harris, Stammen, Justin Wilson, Seth Lugo, hopefully a bounce-back year from Familia or Edwin Diaz. I think we improved our defense behind the plate with Jason Castro, and we hedged our position on Wilson Ramos in case Ramos is slowed by injuries. And I think we rounded out the bench with a very versatile position player that can basically go anywhere on the diamond and has a little bit of pop off of the bench. Again, a lot of the Mets' payroll flexibility will ultimately hinge on the amount they recoup from the Yoenis Cespedes debacle. In addition, we have heard rumblings of a Jed Lowry trade, which would, of course, provide even more room getting out from under his $10 million contract for 2020. All that being said, this is how Brodie Van Wagenen can round out the offseason and put the Mets in a position to compete for the National League East in 2020. So I want to know, what do you guys think? Do you think the Mets will do any of these moves? Do you like these moves? What would you personally like to see them do? Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe to the Anthony Metro podcast for more content like this. And also be sure to subscribe to Anthony Metro on YouTube, where I will be posting news, rumors, and opinions on all things Mets and Major League Baseball. I am Anthony Metro. Let's go Mets.